You wrote in one of your essays that in a decent society, everyone would have the opportunity to find interesting work, and each person would be permitted the fullest possible scope for his talents. And then you went on to ask what more would be required, in particular, extrinsic reward in the form of wealth and power, only if we assume that applying one's talents in interesting and socially useful work is not rewarding in itself. And I think that that line of reasoning is certainly one of the things that appeals to a lot of people, but it still needs to be explained, I think, why the kind of work which people would find interesting and appealing and fulfilling to do would coincide at all closely with the kind of work which, as it were, needs to be done if we're to sustain anything like the standard of living which people demand and are used to.
Well, there's a certain amount of work that just has to be done if we're to maintain that standard of living. It's an open question how onerous that work has to be. Let's recall that science and technology and intellect have not been devoted to examining that question or to overcoming the onerous and self-destructive character of the necessary work of society. The reason is that it has always been assumed that there is a substantial body of wage slaves who will do it simply because otherwise they'll starve. However, if human intelligence is turned to the question of how to make the necessary work of society itself meaningful, we don't know what the answer will be. My guess is that a fair amount of it can be made entirely tolerable. It's a mistake to think that even backbreaking physical labor is necessarily onerous. Many people, I included, do it for relaxation. If it's under our own control, part-time and so on. Well, this weekend, for example, I got it into my head to plant 34 trees in a meadow out behind the house, for example, from the State Conservation Commission, which meant I had to dig 34 holes in the sand. Well, that's, you know, for me and what I do with my time, mostly pretty hard work, but I have to admit I enjoyed it. I wouldn't have enjoyed it if I'd had work norms, if I'd had an overseer, if I'd been ordered to do it at a certain moment, and so on. On the other hand, if it's a task taken out of just interest, fine, that can be done. And I think that and that's without any technology, without any, thought given to how to design the work and so on. You know.
I put it to you that there may be a danger that this view of things is a rather romantic delusion entertained only by a small elite of people who happen, like professors, perhaps journalists and so on, to be in the very privileged situation of having jobs in the sense that they are paid to do what anyway they like to do.
That's why I began with a big if. I said we first have to ask to what extent would the, let's call it the necessary work of society, namely that work which is required to maintain the standard of living that we want. First question is to what extent need this be onerous and undesirable? That's an unknown question, I think much less than it is today. But let's assume there is some extent to which it remains onerous. Well, in that case, the answer is quite simple. That work simply has to be shared. It has to be equally shared among people capable of doing it.
And beyond that, spends a certain number of months a year working on an automobile production line and a certain number of years collecting the garbage. And
if it turns out that these are really tasks which people will find no self-fulfillment in. Incidentally, I don't quite believe that. Say, as I watch people work, craftsmen, let's say, automobile mechanics, for example, I think one often finds a good deal of pride in work. And in fact, I think that kind of pride in work well done, and in complicated work well done, because it takes thought and intelligence to do it, especially when one is also involved in management of the enterprise, determination of how the work will be organized, what it's for, what the purposes of the work are, what will happen to it, and so on. And it seems to me all of this can be satisfying and rewarding activity, which in fact requires skills, and which the kinds of skills that people will enjoy exercising. However, I am thinking hypothetically now. Suppose it turns out that there is some residue of work which really no one wants to do, whatever that may be. Okay, then I say that residue of work must be equally shared. And beyond that, people will be free to exercise their talents as they see fit.
But I put it to you, Professor, that if that residue were very large, as some people would say it was, like it accounted for about the work involved in producing 90% of what we all want to consume, then the organization of sharing it on the basis that everybody did a little bit of all the nasty jobs would become wildly inefficient, because after all, even the nasty jobs you have to be trained to do and equipped to do. And that the efficiency of the whole economy would suffer, and therefore the standard of living which it sustained would be produced.
Well, for one thing, I think this is really quite hypothetical because I don't believe that the figures are anything like that. As I say, it seems to me that if human intelligence were devoted to asking how technology can be designed to fit the needs of the human producer, instead of conversely, that is, now we ask how the human being with his special properties can be fitted into a technological system designed for other ends, namely production for profit. My feeling is that if that were done, we would find that the really unwanted work is far smaller than you suggest. But whatever it is, let's say, whatever amount it is, notice that we have two alternatives. One alternative is to have it equally shared. The other is to design social institutions so that some group of people will be simply compelled to do that work on pain of starvation. Those are the two alternatives.
Well,
now, given those two...
not compelled to do it, but they might agree to do it voluntarily because they were paid to do it an amount which they felt made it worthwhile.
Well, but you see, I'm assuming that everyone essentially gets the essentially equal remuneration. Don't forget that we're not talking about a society now where or perhaps you are, but where the people who do the onerous work are paid substantially more than the people who do the work that they do on choice. It's quite the opposite. The way our society works, the way any class society works, the people who do the unwanted work are the ones who are paid least. That is, that work is done and we sort of put it out of our minds because it's assumed that there will be a massive class of people who who control only one factor of production, namely their labor, and have to sell it. And they'll have to do that work because they have nothing else to do, and they'll be paid very little for it. Now, one can imagine, so I accept a correction, let's imagine three kinds of society. One, the current one, in which the undesired work is given to wage slaves. That's the current system. Let's imagine a second system in which the undesired work, after the best efforts to make it meaningful, the undesired work is shared. And let's imagine a third system where the undesired work receives high extra pay so that individuals voluntarily choose to do it. Well, it seems to me that either of the two latter systems are consistent with, vaguely speaking, anarchist principles. I myself would argue for the second rather than the third, but either of the two is quite remote from any present social organization or any tendency in contemporary social organization.
Let me put the dilemma to you in another way. It seems to me that there is a fundamental choice, however one disguises it, as to whether you organize work for the satisfaction that it gives to the people who do it, or whether you organize it on the basis of the value of what is produced to the people who are going to use or consume what is produced. And that a society which, as it were, was organized on the basis of giving everybody the maximum opportunity to fulfill their hobbies, which is essentially the work for work's sake view, finds its logical culmination in a monastery, whereas the kind of work which is done is, namely prayer, is work for the self-enrichment of the work, and where nothing is produced which is of any use to anybody, and you live either at a low standard of living or you actually starve.
Well, there are some factual assumptions here, and I disagree with you about the factual assumptions. My feeling is that part of what makes work meaningful is that it does have use, that its products do have use. The work of a craftsman is in part meaningful to that craftsman because of the intelligence and skill that he puts into it, but also in part because the work is useful. And I might say the same is true of a scientist. I mean, the fact that the kind of work you do may lead to something else, that's what it means in science, may contribute to something else. That's very important, quite apart from the elegance and beauty of what you may achieve. And I think that covers every field of human endeavor. Furthermore, I think that if we look at a good part of human history, we'll find that people, to a substantial extent, did get some degree of satisfaction, often a lot of satisfaction, from the productive and creative work that they were doing. And I think that the chances for that are enormously enhanced by industrialization. Why? Precisely because much of the most meaningless drudgery can be taken over by machines, which means that the scope for really creative human work is substantially enlarged. Now, you speak of work freely undertaken as hobby, but I don't believe that. I think work freely undertaken can be useful, meaningful work done well. Also, you pose a dilemma, which many people pose, between the desire for satisfaction in work and the desire to create things of value to the community. But it's not so obvious that that's a dilemma, that that's a contradiction. So it's by no means clear, in fact I think it's false, that contributing to the enhancement of pleasure and satisfaction in work is inversely proportional to contributing to the
May
value
not be
of that
inversely
work.
proportional, but it might be unrelated. I mean, take some very simple thing like selling ice creams on the beach on a public holiday. It's a service to society. Undoubtedly, people want the ice creams. They feel hot. On the other hand, it's hard to see in what sense there is either a craftsman's joy or a great sense of social virtue or nobility in performing that task. Why would anyone perform that task if they were not rewarded for it?
I've seen some very cheery-looking ice cream vendors who
Sure,
happen to like the idea,
a lot of money.
and they happen to like the idea that they're giving children ice cream, which seems to me a perfectly reasonable way to spend one's time as compared with thousands of other occupations that I can imagine. Recall that a person has an occupation, and it seems to me that most of the occupations that exist, especially the ones that involve what is called service, that is, relations to human beings, have an intrinsic satisfaction and reward associated with them, namely in the dealings with the human beings that are involved. That's true of teaching, and it's true of ice cream vending. I agree that ice cream vending doesn't require the commitment of intelligence that teaching does, and maybe for that reason it will be a less desired occupation. But if so, it will have to be shared. However, what I'm saying is that our characteristic assumption that pleasure in work, pride in work, is either unrelated to or negatively related to the value of the output, that's an assumption which is related to a particular stage of social history, namely capitalism, in which human beings are tools of production. It is by no means necessarily true. For example, you know, if you look at interviews with workers on assembly lines, for example, that have been done over and over again by people who do industrial psychology, you find that one of the things they complain about over and over again is the fact that their work simply can't be well done. The fact that the assembly line goes through so fast that they cannot do their work properly. Their pride in craftsmanship is itself demeaned. Let me just mention another. Well, I just happened to look recently at a study of longevity in some journal of gerontology. Don't ask me why I was reading that. And it tried to trace the factors that you could use to predict longevity, length of life. And, you know, cigarette smoking, drinking, genetic factors, everything was looked at. It turned out that the factor that was the highest predictor, the most successful predictor, was job satisfaction. Now,
people who have nice jobs live long.
People who are satisfied with their jobs. Now, what leads to job satisfaction? See, and I think that makes a good deal of sense, you know, because that's where you spend your life and that's where your creative activities are. Now, what leads to job satisfaction? Well, I think many things lead to it. And the knowledge that you're doing something useful to the community is an important part of that, which many people feel. I mean, many people feel, and many people who are satisfied with their work are people who feel that what they're doing is important to do. They can be teachers, they can be doctors, they can be scientists, they can be craftsmen, they can be farmers. I mean, I think the feeling that what you're doing is important, is worth doing, you know, contributes to those with whom you have social bonds. That's a very significant factor in one's personal satisfaction. And over and above that, there's the pride in and the self-fulfillment that comes from a job well done, from simply taking your skills and putting them to use. And I don't see any reason why that should be, why that should in any way harm. In fact, I should think that that would enhance the value of what's produced. But let's imagine still that at some level it does harm it. Well, okay, at that point, the society, the community, has to decide how to make compromises. Each individual is both a producer and a consumer, after all. And that means that each individual has to join in those socially determined compromises, if in fact there are compromises. And again, I feel that the nature of the compromise is much exaggerated because of the distorting prism of a really coercive and personally destructive